Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Tuesday, August the 20th, 2024. So yesterday, Monday, was a really hectic day. There was tons of stuff going on. Jupiter was square Saturn. There was a full moon. Full moon was square Uranus. Venus was opposition Saturn. Just everything. And I would guess that was probably almost certainly the busiest day astrologically of the year. And today, it's a little bit of an anticlimax. We've just got the moon in Pisces. That doesn't mean to say that nothing is going to happen. And many of the aspects happening yesterday, which was Monday, are going to carry through. Venus is still opposition Saturn. Jupiter is still square Saturn. And the full moons don't just last for one day. Full moons can last for at least 2 weeks and possibly 4 weeks and maybe even longer in certain circumstances. So we're still feeling the power of that full moon. But if you actually look at what's exact today, it's not quite so impressive. It might seem that nothing much is going on. So this perhaps means that this video is going to be shorter than usual, and certainly yesterday's video was massive. I think it was getting on for 3 hours, which I think is a little bit excessive. Now, just to explain the thumbnail, Ayres pistol kills his wife. He denies playing William Tell. That is a reference to William Burroughs, the American writer who in the 1950s shot his wife, Joan Volmer. They were playing a game where she put a glass on her head and he attempted to shoot the glass off her head and unfortunately killed her. And this happened when Venus was aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint. We also have the Ukraine flag. So at the time of the Ukraine's independence, Venus was aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So the Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint is one thing that is happening today. And that is something I want to talk about. And the black and white picture, well, that is just a picture of a shoal of fish. Because the moon is in Pisces. I mean, why not? Okay, so let me talk about the astrology and the I Ching for today. Now, just a reminder, if you are not subscribed to this channel and you are enjoying my videos, I would really appreciate it if you were to subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but it does make a huge difference to my channel. And if you happen to like this video, of course, I would be really grateful if you were to press the like button. Okay, so turning to the chart itself. So this is a chart here for the position of the planets at noon on Monday, August the 20th, 2024. And you can see that the moon is at 10 Pisces. So pretty much for all of us, the moon is going to be in Pisces, well, all day. Though if you're in Australia and New Zealand, Eastern Asia, it might not be until the morning, even late morning, that the moon goes into Pisces. But I think all of us can basically take the view that this is where the moon is. And I think the moon going into Pisces, for many of us, is actually going to be something of a relief. Because, yesterday we had this full moon. And this full moon was quite dramatic. I reading the comments, I think clearly a lot of you were picking up on the energy of the full moon. We'll have to see over the next few days whether this full moon has actually had any impact. We're still watching it hasn't quite started yet, but the beginning of the Democratic National Convention. Well, that's yesterday. That starts on Monday. So it's very much a full moon event, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. But with the moon moving into Pisces, it just means that the full moon is starting to break up. Because when you had the exact full moon, you had the sun in Leo, moon in Aquarius. So when the moon moves from Aquarius into Pisces, that full moon just isn't quite so strong. It's losing some of its immediate power, and moon moving from Aquarius to Pisces, there's now a little bit more flexibility in the system, and perhaps a little bit of emotional awareness. We can feel what's happening around us, and if we don't like one thing, we can move to something else. And so generally things should be a little bit easier. Sure, the moon does eventually make a conjunction to Saturn, but the moon doesn't make a conjunction to Saturn today. So I think for many of us, I think it should be something of a relief for the moon to be in Pisces. Now, there are a couple of midpoints that possibly need to be referred to, and I'm thinking particularly of Venus. Venus is on the Mars-Jupiter and on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, or at least it's aspecting the Mars-Jupiter and the Mars-Saturn midpoints. I mean, you can see this here. You see there's Venus at 19 Virgo. There's Mars, and there's Saturn. So you can see that Mars is at 2021 Gemini. Saturn is at about 17 Pisces. So the exact midpoint of Venus and Mars, of Mars and Saturn, is going to be at around at 90. It will be at around 4 Taurus. So you've got that makes sense. You can see that by eye, 4 Taurus. So Venus is making an 135 degree aspect today to the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And it's also making a 135 degree aspect to the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. And so 135 degrees is 3/8 of a circle. So if you take a cake and you take 3 equal slices, there's your 3/8. That's your 135 degrees, and it's quite a dynamic aspect. And so we are somewhat conflicted. Venus on the Mars-Jupiter midpoint is about enthusiasm, about being perhaps being happy and wanting to enjoy other people's company in quite a sort of active way. Yet Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint as well. And so that just creates a different and contradictory energy. Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint may be about difficulties with people. We can't quite express ourselves as we'd like to. So it's almost like we have high hopes in terms of other people, but they're not necessarily revealed, or we see different sides to people's personality. It may work the other way. So if we engage with someone, get involved with someone, and we feel that it's just not going anywhere, we should perhaps see it through, because Venus doesn't just make an aspect of the Mars-Saturn midpoint, but it also makes an aspect of the Mars-Jupiter midpoint. So things can change very quickly in terms of other people. It can be a time of real disappointment, but also great enthusiasm. And I suppose, we have to see people from all sides. And Venus isn't just about money. It isn't just about relationships. It can be about money and material things. So there is perhaps in many quarters enthusiasm about gathering stuff, gathering material things, whether it's money or just objects. But at the same time, there is an uncertainty about it. And maybe in certain cases, it might be an uncertainty about one's financial well-being. That's how Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint could work. And it's not just about us as individuals. It can be about society at large. Money matters, and money is going to be something that a lot of us are thinking about. And it's about society also, the economy. And as I said yesterday with the Jupiter-Saturn square, the Jupiter-Saturn square is about the business cycle. It's about whether we expand or whether we contract. And central bankers at the moment are thinking, I'm sure, harder than usual about interest rates, how they're going to bring interest rates down, how they're going to stimulate the economy, how they're going to cope with inflation. So that Jupiter-Saturn square, which we had yesterday, it continues into today. Just because it's not exact, because it's not exact today, because it was exact yesterday, doesn't mean it's not going to have an impact. Likewise, today there's Venus opposition Saturn. Again, it's separating, but it is still very much there. And so we can certainly say that there continues to be today a T-square between Venus and Saturn opposition each other, with Jupiter and Mars on the T. So the tension of that T-square is very much with us, and we are going to perhaps find that other people's actions and behavior may be a little bit contradictory. And we want to get close, but we don't want to get so close, and it could be a little bit difficult to work out. But the moon is in Pisces, and with the moon in Pisces, perhaps we can demonstrate greater flexibility than we were able to show yesterday, because the power of that full moon is over. I mean, the immediate power of that full moon, it is breaking up now with the moon in Pisces, as I said at the beginning of this piece. From a heliocentric position, looking at the positions of the planets when you put the sun in the middle of the solar system, where it should be, here is the heliocentric picture. And what we have is Venus opposition Chiron. So today and probably tomorrow, Venus is making an opposition to Chiron. And so Chiron can be the maverick. It can also be about the wound. And so with Venus opposition Chiron, I don't think we can expect people to behave quite as expected. People might want to do things differently, and they might put a high premium on their own independence with Venus opposition Chiron. And at the same time, Venus can be about style and appearance and how people dress. And so Venus opposition Chiron, some people might want to show that they're different through the things they wear. And when I say other people, well, it might be you, Venus opposition Chiron. That's perhaps what people expect, to do things differently. Though Venus opposition Chiron, we have to see it perhaps in terms of a wound. Remember, Chiron is supposedly the wounded healer, and so with heliocentric Venus opposition Chiron, and it is something collective, and we may just be aware of people with wounds. Maybe not people in our immediate environment, but just people out there in the world. And we just become aware of it, these people who are suffering, and we're perhaps asking ourselves, what can we do to help? Maybe there's nothing we can do to help if they're on the other side of the world. But I think many of us are going to be quite sensitive to suffering out there. It is going to matter to us. And another aspect happening today is the Earth is semi-sextile Neptune. Remember, this is a heliocentric chart. That means that we put the sun in the middle, and so there's no sun in a heliocentric chart because it's in the middle of the chart. So we have the Earth instead, and so the Earth in Aquarius. Remember, the Earth is always going to be opposite the sun. So we've got the sun in Leo, so we've got the earth in Aquarius. So the earth is semi-sextile Neptune. And so with the earth semi-sextile Neptune, there might be misunderstandings. That is possible. And people down here on earth may not actually understand what's going on, or they may be swept into something. They may feel themselves connected to some higher force that they don't fully understand. And it is a semi-sextile, and a semi-sextile is not always a very fortunate aspect. And so what people are trying to do is trying to bring together themselves and their mundane existence with those high-level forces that are happening out there. Those high-level forces, they may be cosmic, they may just relate to the collective unconscious, to what's happening politically, and people will be wanting to become part of some broader movement, but it's a semi-sextile, so it may actually be difficult to be really in the flow. But I think some of us, perhaps all of us at some level, want to be part of the shoal, part of a shoal of fish. And I suppose that's Moon in Pisces. Yeah, I know our independence is really important to us, but I think all of us, it would be nice to be part of something, and to be part of something that we 100% agreed with. Maybe that's what Earth semi-sextile Neptune is all about, that quest for oneness. Okay, that's a heliocentric picture. Not a great deal happening, but I think the Venus opposition Chiron, Earth semi-sextile Neptune are of interest. So let me now do my forecasts for the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Tuesday, August the 20th, 2024. Aries, you have done your bit. It's all been perhaps rather exhausting, and I think, Aries, you may feel that you don't really need to do much more, at least in the short term. You don't have to be seen. You don't even necessarily have to be heard. You perhaps want to recharge your batteries, and I think that would be an excellent thing to do. You only have so much energy at your disposal, and I think the last few days might have been quite exhausting, and if you want to do nothing much today, then that is probably okay. But still, it's going to be difficult to do absolutely nothing today. And you're going to, I suppose, feel that you have got answers that perhaps other people are missing. Answers which to you are completely obvious. And these answers just may relate to the way things are done. They could relate to rules, how one relates to authority, and you're going to have a very good understanding of all of this. And so your advice could be very precious. And your advice, as I've already suggested, is not going to be crazy. You're actually capable of giving very good and practical advice, which I think is realistic. Some people think they can just do what they like. They can just act in their own way, and they can ignore the realities of living in society. One of those realities, for example, is the law, or dealing with power relations. And Aries, you will have a very good understanding of this, and I think that you'll be able to tell people what they can and cannot do. And you may be uncharacteristically firm and authoritative, and indeed some people might actually regard you as being a little bit boring. But boring is good. Boring in the sense that you're just being realistic. And today yes, Aries, I think that you can be very realistic, and you also, I think, are aware about what can and can what can and cannot be done. For example, in your social life, you're seeing people for what they are, and you have a good understanding of people's faults, what they're getting wrong, and I suppose if you're going to criticize people, you have to sort of do it in a sort of a fairly gentle way. But criticism is perhaps part of it, especially if someone is doing something wrong. And probably, Aries, if you have got big plans, still your best work will probably be done behind the scenes. You just, as I've already suggested, you don't have the energy to be in the bright lights. You've done that, and now it's time to think about yourself and to make sure that you really do have peace and quiet. That just is important. Now, one thing I should say is that Venus is starting to make a square to Mars, which is your ruler, and Venus is in a somewhat difficult position. And so Venus is not about you, it's probably about other people. And Venus is in Virgo, the sign of its fall, and Venus is actually conjunct Black Moon Lilith. And so with Venus conjunct Black Moon Lilith and it's making a square to Mars, it may be that you and certain other people have a somewhat uneasy relationship, and perhaps you can see where someone is going wrong. And in fact, Aries, you're starting to be able to see the darkness in people. We've all got a darkness to us. It's something universal, but the darkness, as far as you're concerned, is close to the surface. You can really see what people are like. Now, just because you can see the darkness in someone doesn't mean that you should have nothing to do with them. It's just that you can see it, you're aware of it. You can almost comment on it. And that means just today and over the next couple of days, there just may be a certain sense of uneasiness when you're with other people, when you get very close to other people, unless you really trust them. But you can see what they're carrying, and you can sort of see their past, and you can see their past in their present. And because of that, you might have a certain wariness. And of course, if someone gets too close to you and you're not comfortable about them getting too close to you, then with that Venus square Mars, you're able to put up the boundaries. You're able to turn on the electric fence, and you can get people to back off very quickly. But if that's appropriate, you have to ask yourself whether or not there really is any kind of threat. And when I say threat, I don't think I'm talking about any physical threat. It's just a threat for just someone getting in your space and taking up your time and draining your precious energy. That's perhaps what it's all about today. It's your precious energy. You only have so much energy, and if you expend this energy on things that are wasteful or people just demanding attention, you're not going to be happy about that. So do whatever it takes, Aries, to conserve your energy. Taurus, you do have at the moment a few reservations. I mean, you certainly want to have, I think, an active social life. You feel that other people are important, and you'll perhaps enjoy at some level being in a group, but there are limits. And on one hand, if you're with people, you might be asking yourself, well, where actually are things going? And you might then reach the conclusion that if you really think about it, things might not actually be going anywhere at all. And that might concern you. People promise a lot. And at first the promise is convincing, but when you actually look at the meaning of a promise and whether or not that promise can be honoured, you might be somewhat disappointed. Now, the question is, if you feel yourself to be let down today, why would it be happening? Is it because other people are just being unreliable? That's absolutely possible. Or is it because some of your expectations are unrealistic? And, we do have Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, I will be talking at great length about the Mars-Saturn midpoint later in the video if you want to watch that part of the video. I understand you may just be watching this to see what I have to say about Taurus. But with Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint, there may be, at the moment, at times when you just feel that things are not entirely working, and it may just feel all a waste of time. You're trying hard to do something, but it just is not working. And also, with Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint, it could be about fear. It could be just about your fears for the future, and perhaps passing negativity about yourself. So when you consider how other people are responding to you and you feel that they're responding in a less than perfect way, it just may be about your perceptions. Because what Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint is doing is it's like a filter. It's filtering your perceptions of the world as the information comes into your five senses or even your six senses. It's providing a filter, and it's a filter of, I suppose, negativity. So you might take an input which is perfectly fine and just interpret it in a somewhat negative way. So do be aware of that possibility, Taurus. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but you perhaps have to make a little bit of an effort to be positive, because Venus is not just aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint, it's actually aspecting the Mars-Jupiter midpoint as well. So with Venus aspecting the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, that provides a very different message. That is a message of hope and optimism and making things happen. So at one stage, at one level, you want things to happen. At another level, you feel that you're afraid. What would happen if you were to take the initiative? And I suppose you have to get the balance right. One often thinks that fear is a bad thing. Now, fear is not a bad thing, provided it doesn't get out of control. So if you are rational, you have a certain wisdom there. You can certainly see how things can go wrong, and you can see the opportunity. And neither of these cognitions must get out of control. You mustn't be so concerned about getting ahead, seizing the opportunity, that you take leave of your common sense. On the other hand, you mustn't be so afraid of what might go wrong that you're brought to a standstill. So do get the balance right. And it may be that if you can get the balance right, Taurus, you can actually be, very grounded and very realistic. And, going on about your fears, the past is the past. What's happened in the past has happened. And, even the distant past, there's always that temptation to think that the past is going to repeat itself. When we see certain connections between something we're in, linking back to the past, we might have a sort of a sense of a whole inevitability of the thing. And Taurus, you may be right. Sometimes the past does repeat itself, but we don't want to be irrational about it. Remembering that Venus, your ruler, is getting very close to true Black Moon Lilith. Right at the moment, we've got Venus at noon New York time. Venus, your ruler, is at 19:06 Virgo. Black Moon Lilith, true Black Moon Lilith, is at 19:41 Virgo. And I would see this conjunction as being about the past, you remembering things, and with those memories may come some fear, but you mustn't allow that fear to overwhelm you. But if you perhaps realize that fears you have are connected with the past and are perhaps not connected with the future and with the present circumstances, that might actually be quite liberating, because you might be in a position then to actually understand your fears. And of course, once you understand your fears, you'll then be able to make balanced decisions. Gemini, I was pretty tough on Geminis yesterday. I was really quite negative on Geminis. Now, of course, that doesn't mean I'm biased against Geminis, because I'm a Gemini myself. At least my sun is in Gemini, not my ascendant. I'm Taurus rising. But with your feelings about yesterday, I think yesterday was quite tough. And Mercury is true. Mercury is still retrograde, and Mercury is still conjunct the Sun, but it's not quite as intense as yesterday. And I think that you have greater scope today for seeing things in a sort of a rational and detached and logical kind of way. And so I would suspect today that you have more freedom than yesterday. And it's a lot to do with your cognitions, just not perhaps having such a negative view. And the moon is moving into Pisces, and I think from your perspective, a moon going into Pisces is a really good thing. I know that Gemini and Pisces are two signs that do have differences. I mean, Pisces is a water sign, Gemini is an air sign, but they're both mutable, and they both have the scope for change and being able to adjust to changing situations and circumstances. And I think that with the moon in Pisces, you're going to have a greater sense of what is possible and what you might actually be able to achieve. Because Pisces in the Gemini chart is actually a very high profile sign. It's at the top of your chart. And so with moon going into Pisces, what used to be an immovable object, something that might have felt a real obstacle, is now something a little less frightening, a little less immovable. You can now see, well, maybe you can move around this object, maybe you can lever this object out of the way, and once you've done that, you can actually start to make, I think, pretty good progress. And it's not that you're going to get concrete results. I don't think it's that kind of day. But I think that you can start on the path to getting concrete results. And you will be helped by a new dynamism. You'll have a dynamism today which I don't think you had yesterday. You'll be starting to think about what you can do to make things happen, and what seemed to be an absolute impossibility yesterday now seems like an objective. It's something you want to focus on, and you want to focus on it with all your power. And in fact, today, the Geminis are able to bring to bear a large amount of power, maybe an overwhelming amount of power. But you don't have to go over the top. You have to use as much power as is necessary. You don't want to, try try to crack the proverbial peanut with a sledgehammer, do you? I mean, there is that temptation. And there is an overall temptation to overreact. So overreaction could be part of today's experience, but you don't want to overreact. You want to just work out what you need to do to achieve your goals, and you don't want to go any further than that. And when I say achieve your goals, I'm not talking about goals that can be necessarily achieved today. I don't think today is about having targets which you're going to, which you have to achieve, for example, by midnight. No, it's not about that. You can start on your path, and you'll have the power to do this without needing to sort of go into overdrive. I suppose on a physical level, if you have allergies, if you're allergic to something, or if you think that you might be allergic to something, it is possible that your allergic response could be a little bit greater than usual. I don't really like to talk about astrology and health. And remember, these readings are, they are, I suppose they're a little bit general. But I don't want you to sort of go away and start to worry. But just consider that possibility in terms maybe of what you are consuming, where you are going. So if you are consuming something which in the past you might have been slightly allergic to, or you're going somewhere you might have been slightly allergic to the dust or whatever, and if you have any concerns about that, then I think it's a day when probably you should err on the side of caution. So don't consume things or go places where there's any concerns about allergies, because if you've been allergic to something in the past, then your response system may be a little bit stronger than usual today. So I'm just urging a little bit of caution in that department, but please don't worry about it. You know what your allergies are, and I suppose we should all avoid things that we are allergic to. Cancer. I think Cancer, it's going to be an easier day than yesterday. So yesterday, Cancer, we had this full moon, and Cancerians are sensitive to the lunar cycle, and you can really feel that dramatic clash between moon in Aquarius, sun in Leo, these two principles which were just at odds with one another. And it might have been a little bit exhausting on a psychic level. But now the moon is moving into Pisces, and I think that is good news. Pisces and Cancer have a natural affinity with one another, the two signs. I mean, they're both water signs. They both relate to each other very well. And so as the moon moves out of Aquarius into Pisces, I think there is going to be a great sense of relief. Now, just a word about time zones. If you are in, say, Australia or New Zealand, the moon will move into Pisces, I think, sort of late morning. So you may have, at the beginning of the day, you might have a bit of time with the moon in Aquarius. I mean, the same goes for sort of East Asia, I suppose, parts of maybe Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, perhaps. There may be parts of the morning where the moon is still in Aquarius, but certainly by midday, wherever you are, the moon is going to be in Pisces. And so with the moon in Pisces, whatever your time zone, it's just going to be a time when things are, I think, less intense. And I think that's the important point. You won't get so riled by things. You won't be so into this concept that it's a serious, dangerous world. I think that you'll be able to relax more and also explore possibilities. So perhaps in a recent past, particularly with this full moon, you may have been aware of possibilities, things that you could be doing, but you might have thought that it's just too dangerous. You didn't want to take the risk. But now with a moon in Pisces, because you're more relaxed and because you have a better sense of perspective, I think you're going to be able to be more adventurous. And another thing with a moon in Pisces, the moon in Pisces, it's in a water sign, and it will aid your sensitivity, because one of the problems that Cancerians perhaps have been facing over the last few weeks is that there hasn't been much in water signs. Yeah, sure, we've had Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, but we haven't had any personal planets in water signs. Everything's moved out of Cancer a long time ago, and so things might just feel a little bit dry, as if the rains haven't been coming. Where are the rains? I suppose it may feel like those last days before the monsoon. Well, I don't know. I'm not saying that the monsoon is going to happen anytime soon. I mean, the monsoon on a sort of astrological sense, it's a long time before anything moves into Scorpio. But with the moon in Pisces, it does just create a little bit of moisture. We do see some rain. Again, I'm not talking about real rain. I mean, it may be real rain. It was actually raining last night, but here in Washington State. But rain in an emotional sense, and with that emotional rain, just comes some flexibility, and also an ability perhaps to, I won't say take risks, but perhaps to do things which not so long ago you thought were just inadvisable, and perhaps you can get in touch with new things, new experiences. At least you can make some inquiries, because I think now when you see what's going on, you may feel that your horizons are just a little bit limited, and perhaps that you can do things to broaden your horizons. Perhaps there's something you just know you don't know enough about, and perhaps you can get the information you need, or perhaps you can go somewhere, maybe not today, but perhaps tomorrow, or get in touch with someone just to make things more interesting for yourself, because I think you have lost, or you're losing, a lot of the fear that you perhaps had over the last couple of days. Leo, you at the moment are, I would have said, quite clever. I think your cleverness is obvious, and you're really able to do things which really demonstrate your skill and your experience. So it's important, Leo, not to doubt yourself. So think about all the things you can do, and maybe as a result of the full moon yesterday, that has given you some insights. Okay, not just about what you can do, but also what you can't do. And so perhaps that full moon has given you a greater sense of limitation. But limitations are good. Limitations are always good, provided they don't go too far, because where there's a limitation, there's a structure and there's a focus. And today you actually seem to be very focused on what you're good at, and you're able to really explain what you're good at, and also demonstrate it. Because it's not just about words, is it? In fact, words are not the point. People actually want to see action. How often has it been the case? You talk about something and people are just not interested. But when you actually do it, everything changes. I remember, decades ago, I was trying to. It was at the beginning of cell phones, and I'd worked out this cell phone tarot program that you could do on a cell phone. I think this was, I don't know, this was maybe 2001, and I was trying to persuade. When I was working, I had this contract work with a cell phone company, and I'd worked it out, and I told these people about it, and I wrote it up, and they said, yeah, they weren't particularly interested. They thought in theory it was a nice idea, but they didn't actually do it. So I remember I don't really know about computer programming. I spent about a month just solidly writing this program so that you could get a tarot program on a cell phone. This is the days before smartphones, and I worked it out, and I got some server for a cell phone, and which would, where you could do websites and on a cell phone, and I made it so you could actually see this thing work on a cell phone. And then when I gave them a link, I said, well, you look at your cell phone, I've got this tarot program. The moment I showed them how it was done, everything changed. They were very interested in it, and I got a contract, and they kind of they started using the program, and they used it for some years. Of course, my contract eventually came to an end. They didn't need me anymore, but for a short time, it was very impressive. And so this is what I'm saying with you. It's perhaps not enough to say what you can do. You need to perhaps demonstrate it. And so, Leo, if you can actually demonstrate your plan, it's not enough to perhaps talk about it or write about it. You put it into action, whatever it is. Now, this might be some aspect of your creativity. It could be about something entrepreneurial. You perhaps have a business idea, or some social project. It could be something charitable. It could be about political activism. Whatever it is you're interested in. Have a demonstration, a real demonstration, and I think that people are going to be really impressed. And that it's not really just about impressing people. It's actually more fundamental than that, because what's happening at the moment, Leo, is that you're able to tune into, fundamentally the person who you really are. And it's one of those moments when you can do it. And so because you're being so genuine, Leo, I think that things really are starting to move. But you've got to take the initiative. You mustn't doubt yourself. I mean, there's some possibility that you might have some doubts today, because the moon is in Pisces, and I suppose Pisces is not a sign that you have an immediate affinity for. But the thing about Pisces for you, Leo, is that Pisces is an emotionally alive sign, and it allows you to reach into who you are on an emotional and inspirational level, and then you can give yourself the full power treatment, and you give it everything you've got, and then people see it and people recognize it. And I think that is how best to deal with things. And don't be overwhelmed by anyone. The moon is starting to make a conjunction to Saturn, and with that moon conjunct Saturn, you might be a little too deferential. You might think that certain people should be respected, and you need to be very cautious with them. No, I think you need to respect everyone, but you shouldn't be overwhelmed by anyone or overawed by them, because it's all about you. But it's all about you, not in an egotistical way. It's all about what you can bring to bear. And I do think that today, if you're really honest with yourself, you will start to recognize what you can actually achieve, and other people need to recognize it. They really do. Virgo, I think had quite a difficult time yesterday, in theory at least. I mean, Mercury, your ruler, was under a lot of pressure. It wasn't just retrograde. It was pretty close to the sun, and so with Mercury conjunct the sun, you might have felt a little bit burnt out. I mean, Mercury is still conjunct the sun, and so Virgo, you still recognize that you have to take things easy. You can't move too quickly, otherwise you're just going to burn yourself out. And so Virgo, don't be in a hurry, but at the same time, Virgo, don't underestimate yourself, and don't underestimate what actually you can achieve, because now you're starting to realize, I hope, that you are actually quite powerful. You do have a lot of power, and you can bring this power to bear on whatever needs to be changed and controlled. I mean, I think that part of this power might relate to your understanding of other people and understanding of the world in which you have to function. Perhaps sort of yesterday you just didn't have the sensitivity to see it. I think now you have got the sensitivity, and sure, you understand your own weaknesses, but you also understand other people's weaknesses and other people's vulnerabilities, and how to engage other people, and how to attract other people, and how to attract their attention. And so, Virgo, this does allow you, I think, to really make quite a powerful impact. And I think today it might be quite difficult to ignore you, because your presence is obvious, but it's just so important that you understand that it's a two-way process. It's not just about you getting attention. It's about you giving other people attention, because when you give other people attention, that naturally gives a boost to your own power. And so this two-way process, I think, is really going to give you a quite powerful boost. And so I think that today's a day when perhaps you're going to get your confidence back. Okay, I'm not saying you ever lost your confidence, but I think you could be quite confident. But you perhaps need a little bit of a demonstration. Virgos can sometimes be doubting, and they might think that something is possible. Perhaps you need to arrange a demonstration. Just do something simple which demonstrates your ability to have an influence. It could be anything. It could just be having a conversation. Perhaps the first conversation you have today, give yourself the target of trying to convince something, perhaps trying to convince someone about something, or perhaps raising a philosophical or political view and seeing what the response is, and seeing if you can change someone's mind just a little bit. But it's a demonstration, just to prove to yourself that you can have an influence, that you can change people's minds, and that if you're hitting any roadblocks, any resistance, there actually is a way for you to get round this resistance. And it's all part of the way you build your confidence. And I think that pretty much every obstacle you meet today, you can deal with it constructively, and I think that you can. It's because I suppose you can be flexible, and you can benefit from the fact that the moon is in Pisces. Great thing about moon in Pisces, it represents the water, it represents the tide, and it doesn't matter how big an obstacle is, the tide will be able to get round it. In fact, give it long enough and the tide will be able to erode just about everything. The concrete will be eroded, steel will be eroded. The force of water is just constant. And so that's perhaps another way in which you can use your power. And it may not feel entirely natural to begin with, but just assert yourself, keep asserting yourself, and you'll be surprised, by how much you really can achieve. And you should not forget, Virgo, that Mars and Jupiter are still in Gemini. Mars and Jupiter may be 3 degrees apart. The Mars-Jupiter conjunction was, last week sometime. But that Mars-Jupiter conjunction is still very real for you. And it's still pushing you in a particular direction. And it is about your ambition and what you want to achieve. And Mars may leave Gemini fairly soon, but Jupiter is not going to leave Gemini until the early summer of next year, and so that is a reminder that there's a lot of things you can do, and I think the main thing today is to boost your confidence, give yourself some examples of how you can change someone's mind, how you can resolve a particular problem, or you can remove a roadblock. Give yourself some examples, and those examples will give you confidence to escalate, to move to perhaps loftier tasks and loftier challenges. Libra. So I mentioned the fact that Venus, which is your ruler, is on both the Mars-Jupiter and Mars-Saturn midpoints, or at least it's aspecting the Mars-Jupiter and Mars-Saturn midpoints. And I think this could have quite an impact on you, and it's a sort of contradictory impact. So with Venus on the Mars-Jupiter midpoint, you may feel that you have a lot of energy, that there are a lot of things you want to do, and you're not satisfied with second best, and you'll be on the lookout for just ways to just apply your energy. On the other hand, Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and that gives us a very different feel. Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint can be somewhat frustrating. Lots of things you want to do with Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint, but are you actually going to be able to accomplish them? And so, there's a case that, you might just feel so frustrated you just give up on it. But so you've got this sort of contradictory energy here, and it can be just difficult to know which way to turn, which way, what exactly you should be doing. Well, how do we deal with this? Well, I would have said that you need to certainly accept the limitations in front of you. Limitations have always got to be accepted, and the restrictions have often got to be accepted. You can't pretend they don't exist. But once you realize that something exists, doesn't mean to say that you should just give up on the matter. You should accept that there are ways around it if you apply yourself. And in fact, if you look at if you look at what's actually happening in terms of the sort of midpoint tree. Let me just show you this, what I mean, Libra. I don't know whether you're just listening to me or you're just watching as well, but I'm just going to demonstrate something. Just if we look at where the midpoints are, if we look at exactly where the midpoints are, we can see that, you see, the Mars-Saturn midpoint is at around 359 Taurus, and the Mars-Jupiter midpoint is at 4 degrees 4 Taurus. So what does that actually mean? It means that the Mars-Jupiter midpoint comes after the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So it's like, symbolically, you might see first you hit Mars-Saturn, then you hit Mars-Jupiter. So that Venus goes from one to the other. So it's likely that the feelings of frustration and feeling that you just can't get anything done will come before the feelings of liberation and being super energetic. I mean, not by much, but if you're starting to feel that things are just not going your way, that you can't get anything done, it's just important not to give up. Keep going, keep seeing it through. And then there will be a switch, there will be a change, and you will be able to apply that energy in a meaningful way. And so persistence today and having an underlying optimism is just going to be really important. Now, underlying optimism, you can still be realistic. You can be realistic about the challenges in front of you. That is certainly true. But the optimism, I think, Libra, will, in the end, see you through. And at the same time, Libra, Mars-Jupiter, Venus on the Mars-Jupiter, it can scatter if you're not careful. You could just have so much energy that once the dam breaks, once you start putting your energy into something, it can just all be too much of a good thing, and you may not accomplish everything you would like to accomplish. And so a little bit of discipline would, I think, be useful. And I think if you do take a disciplined approach today and you just concentrate on the things that matter. You obviously got to decide what matters, but I think you're going to have a good sense of that. You concentrate on what matters, and you just ignore information which is frankly irrelevant, or maybe it's something that can be dealt with tomorrow or next week, but it doesn't have to be dealt with now. So just being very focused, Libra, is just going to be extremely important. Now, one aspect I should perhaps mention is the fact that Venus is not just on the Mars-Jupiter and the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Venus is also conjunct Black Moon Lilith, and that might have an impact on you. And I don't want to exaggerate this conjunction between Venus and true Black Moon Lilith, but it may be that you are thinking about the past quite a lot and the emotions of the past, and you may be thinking about things which you perhaps don't really want to think about, but still you can't help it. And it's important that if you are going in this kind of direction, that you do it in a constructive way. You don't want to obsess about the past in a negative way, in a sense of in a way which is not really going to get you anywhere. If you are going to be spending time on the past, perhaps thinking about the darkness of the past, you must be doing it in a constructive way, where you have perhaps have a particular goal in mind. What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to uncover? And there may be a chance here too, uncover something from the past, to really get to grips with something that happened in the past that you haven't fully understood. We can have moments of insight. It does happen. You can go somewhere and be meditating on an event that took place, I don't know, 50 years before, and suddenly it clicks and you actually understand what happened 50 years ago. It can happen. It really can happen. And suddenly it makes sense, and it actually transforms who you are, and it transforms your relationship with people who may in fact be long dead. It depends how old you are, but if you're old enough to have people you've known who are long dead, these relationships still exist, and you suddenly get it, and it makes sense. So do open yourself to that possibility, but it should be a liberation. It should not be about an obsession. Scorpio, I think, Scorpio, that things are improving. You're feeling more at one with yourself. Some of the sort of complications in the recent past are starting to resolve. Yesterday we had this full moon, which I think some Scorpios might have been a little bit bothered by. It might have forced you to spend more time than you wanted on having to deal with particular, perhaps domestic or emotional issues, and it was a bit difficult. But this full moon is now starting to break up. And today the moon is in Pisces. Okay, it might not move into Pisces until the late morning if you're in Australasia or East Asia, but still the moon is in Pisces, or is at least moving into Pisces. And I think that from a Scorpio view, I think that is something very much to be welcomed. You feel that you're more yourself, that you can express yourself better, and at the same time, I think that you're being taken more seriously. But, Scorpios are always serious people. They do have a sense of fun, and I mean that sense of fun really does matter with a moon in Pisces. So you can kind of enjoy yourself, but that seriousness shouldn't be forgotten, especially in terms of relating to other people, because you do have a serious message, and that serious message perhaps is about society, it's about the law of the land, it's what people are attempting to do, but you are quite responsible in that sense. So you can tell people it as it is. You can give tough advice, and you can advise people in a way that is really very absolute. It'll be very clear that you completely know what you're talking about, and you will have a good understanding of how power and authority and how laws work, and you will be able to articulate this. So certainly a good day if you are a Scorpio lawyer, but even if you're not a lawyer, you just know the law, you know the rules, and you will be able to articulate the rules. And I do think, Scorpio, that people will listen to you, but it can be a fun day, as I've already said. It's a day when there is greater scope, I think, to relax, to be able to enjoy yourself, but in a way that is not trivial. Well, nothing is trivial really for a Scorpio, is it? Is it? But it's enjoyment that's very real, that's very powerful, that does tune into who you are, and at the same time, there's no pressure on you. And I think that was a problem about yesterday. Yesterday, it may have felt that there was pressure on you. But I think with the moon moving into Pisces, just that pressure has just gone, and that just allows you to be yourself, and it allows you to exist in the moment. And I think that that is something you're going to really appreciate. Now, one word about relationships. Now, with relationships, perhaps especially close relationships, you may have to be a little sensitive, because some people are distracted by something or concerned about something. They feel that things aren't quite right, and there's a certain sense of nervousness there. It's not your nervousness, it's another person's nervousness. And people are unwilling to commit, they're unwilling to be open about the facts of the matter, and they're things that they're keeping to themselves. And you have to decide how best to deal with this. It may be that if you notice that people are being very reserved and they don't want to discuss things, or it appears that they don't want to discuss things, it just may be that you should just leave them be. They will open up in their own way at their own time. And I think, in fact, in most cases that is the case. But you might also want to consider people's motivations. And people may be motivated by things which are deeply psychological. You know, we expect people to be motivated by simple things like, I don't know, money and power and what needs to be done today, or whether or not one is going to get a promotion, or I don't know, these kind of things. You do not expect people to be motivated by something that is deeply psychological. But I suppose as a Scorpio, you understand this. You have your own deep psychological motivations, and because of that, you can start to understand other people's psychology. And I don't think you actually have to ask so many questions. You don't have to intrude. You don't have to say what is bothering you. In fact, that would be a really bad thing to say, I think. You know that. And silence can be very useful. Silence can tell you everything. And so in the silence, Scorpio, you can really understand fundamentally what motivates certain people, and you will realize that their motivations are not immediately practical and are not immediately obvious. It's not just about money and power. It's about something very deep. You don't necessarily understand it in its full sense, but you just you can feel that it is something from the past which is definitely having a presence in the here and now. And you know, with that knowledge, I think that you're going to be in a much better position to deal with people and to, understand what motivates them. Sagittarius. So yesterday, Sagittarius, we had the square to Saturn, and it's true that this square between Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter, of course, is your ruler. So yesterday, Jupiter was square Saturn. And so you could say, well, this Jupiter square Saturn is starting to move on. It's not exact anymore, but it's still pretty exact. I mean, Jupiter is only 10 arc minutes away from the square to Saturn. And this Jupiter square Saturn is going to be important, not just today. It's probably going to be important for the next week or two. It's not something that's just going to, it's not just something that's going to go away. But still, you need to get it in perspective. Perhaps you're just getting used to its energy, because I don't really want to talk about the Jupiter-Saturn square every single time I talk about Sagittarius. But it's just a reminder, Sagittarius, of your own seriousness and other people's seriousness, and just the fact that you might have all of these plans and you might have all these things you want to do, and it's all very exciting, but fundamentally you have to be secure, you have to be grounded, and it might be a bit boring, but you always have to keep in mind your base. And there always needs to be a base. There needs to be something, which both your 2 feet are standing on. That piece of concrete in your life that on which which supports everything else. So always consider that. And once you have a clear sense of your base, of that piece of concrete on which you're standing on, well, it shouldn't really be concrete, should it? I mean, it should be the earth, the living earth which nurtures you. And that's what you should be standing on. And so Sagittarius, once you've got that grounding, things are just going to be a lot easier. And I think that you're going to find it easier to relate to other people, and people are going to trust you more. Because if you are not grounded, and if you don't actually trust yourself, then how can you expect anyone to trust you? So perhaps that's your first task with this Jupiter square Saturn. It is to trust yourself. To trust yourself, to have created a secure base for yourself. And then other people are going to start to trust in you, and they will confide in you. And in fact, today, you may actually find that your social skills are actually pretty good. You'll find that you really can interact with lots of different people. Each interaction might seem in itself pretty trivial, but when you look at the scope of the interactions you're having today, it's showing you, I suppose, a broader picture. It's showing you something that is, I suppose, exciting and vibrant, and above all, it is about your connections. And going back to grounding, I suppose grounding is also about being grounded in the social world, understanding where you actually are in terms of all the sort of networks around you. You have your place in the network. It may not be a prominent place in the network, it may not be a central hub, but you are still part of a network, and that part of a network in its own way is pretty grounding. And while this is happening, we've got the moon moving into Pisces, and moon moving into Pisces, I think for you is good news. Pisces is a very fundamental sign in the Sagittarius chart. It does represent your grounding, but of course Pisces is a water sign, and I suppose part of that grounding is being part of the collective. And it goes back to what I was saying about being part of a network. You have your role in the collective. You're not a total individual. None of us are total individuals, because when you think about the collective unconscious, that's what we're tied into. We can't get away from it. And in terms of how we relate to society and the world around us, we have our common symbols, and the common symbols, common customs, and they're the things that make us feel real on our own, disconnected from the collective. Nothing is real. We are totally separate, and we could not possibly thrive. And so that may be perhaps the challenge, perhaps to see where actually you are in the collective, and what your particular wider role is. Now, one point about society and the world in which you work that should be mentioned is the fact that Venus is making a conjunction to true black moon Lilith. And this conjunction between Venus and true black moon Lilith takes place in Virgo. Virgo in the Sagittarian chart is very high profile. And so as you go about your daily business, and particularly at times when you're trying to assert yourself in society, when you're trying to make an appearance, you may come across other people and you may be wondering about them. It occurs to you that some people do have an exaggeratedly high opinion of themselves, and a high opinion of themselves which seems a little bit fragile. That's often the case, isn't it? And you may be wondering, what is the basis of that fragility? And true black moon Lilith may say something about that. It's about perhaps a fundamental weakness and an insecurity that everyone, well, not everyone, but some people are carrying. Now that sense of insecurity may be personal. It may just be that people are responding to the world in which we're living and how complicated it is and how difficult it is and how I suppose dark it is, because I suppose we're talking about black moon Lilith. So, dark forces are abroad, as they say. And I think that darkness is just going to be reflected in some of the people you come across, but perhaps authority figures, people who are trying to assert themselves, trying to use power. And so authority figures who are concerned about appearances, but also who are concealing something. And as a Sagittarius, you can feel what they are concealing, and what they are concealing, I suppose, is a fundamental vulnerability. And once you see someone responding to their own vulnerabilities in a rather exaggerated, power-hungry way, you'll perhaps be in a better position to respond in an appropriate way. I mean, if you've got people who are vulnerable, well, vulnerable people who are concerned about holding on to power can actually be very dangerous. I think you know this, Sagittarius, and so that may sort of moderate your behavior, and you may just have to behave in a particular way so as to sort of skirt the problem. Capricorn, it's probably an easier day when there is less responsibility. Recently there has been a feeling of responsibility, just a feeling that there are things that you're supposed to do. But I think today you can be a little more relaxed, and you can look at the world and you can just take it or leave it. And you will have, I think, quite a lot to say for yourself, but it doesn't have to be particularly focused. You can almost just say what's on your mind. I think talking today could actually be quite therapeutic. So if you get the chance to talk, maybe just about nothing in particular, it's just gonna make things easier for you. You'll feel comfortable, and you'll just feel that it's a way to reintegrate yourself with the social world. And it is true, actually, Capricorn, that from a social perspective, you could be actually quite effective. I think that people are going to sort of gravitate towards you, and if you want to break the ice, you see that there's someone you'd maybe like to talk to, then maybe that's just something you should do. Just talk to them. It doesn't matter what you talk about, but do take advantage of any opportunity to get to know someone. Somehow it's going to be useful, or at the very least it's going to be helpful. It's going to make you feel more integrated. And so I think that, light conversation is certainly something you can do. I know that you're not particularly interested in light conversation, but you have to start somewhere. If things get deeper and more intense, well, that's fine. But just consider where you are and what your role is, and it may be a day for going places. Not going places that are far away, just going places because you might be gently interested in just seeing what somewhere is like, and so perhaps it depends on where you are, whether you go on foot, by car, whatever, or bus, just go somewhere. Perhaps somewhere you just wanted to go, you wanted to see. Again, this is somewhere I don't think very far away, just maybe a few hundred yards away, or a few hundred meters away, or a few miles or kilometers away. Just going somewhere slightly different and just seeing perhaps something new and sating your curiosity. Because I think actually, Capricorn, you are quite curious, and you may have some questions that you want answered. And sure, you could probably make a phone call to get these questions answered, or even check on the internet, but there's nothing like going somewhere to actually answer a question. It may actually be a very trivial question. What does something look like the last time you were there? Is a sign red or is it green? I don't know. Does it matter? Well, it may matter. For some reason, just you want to go and look at this sign, look at this house or whatever, just to put your mind at ease. And in the process, something else might happen, because you're just making you should be trying to make things happen on a very local level, just to create sort of ripples and waves, and communicating with the people right close to you, and one thing could lead to another thing, and it will just make everything a lot easier. But I must emphasize, Capricorn, there's nothing really you have to do. You shouldn't regard yourself as being responsible to anyone. Okay, you're responsible to yourself, but it really needn't go further than that. Aquarius, you possibly feel that you need to consider what you have. I have to be very careful with that. Say what you have, and because what you have can have many meanings for different people. Now, to some people, what you have is about how much money you've got in the bank. But I absolutely understand that to other people, money in the bank is totally irrelevant. There's even a suggestion you don't even want to do an astrology. You look at consult an astrologer, or see the Aquarius forecast. You don't want to know about money. It might seem, almost dirty to talk about money. It depends on you. But what money reflects is just what we have. And different people have different ideas about what we have. What we have can be a sense of purpose. What we have can be a past. What we have can be, things we've collected over the years. Whatever it is, pieces of china, souvenirs. It's like they used to have. I remember I had this teacher when I was about 5 or 6. I had this teacher, and she had this huge collection of dolls, You know how you have these tourist dolls, don't you? They used to have, you go to Rome and you see some doll dressed up in something characteristic of Rome, and or no, you'd have another one of New York. Maybe they don't do it anymore, but certainly in the 60s, this was quite a common thing. And apparently she had loads of them. She had dozens, maybe hundreds of them from all of the places. That was what she had, and I'm sure that the financial value of these dolls was pretty much zero, but it was important to her. And so what you have is really important. It's amazing when I talk about these things, these memories. I hadn't really thought about this teacher and the dolls. I don't think since I was 6 or 7, and this memory's just come to me from, I don't know, over 50 years ago. It just happens like that, doesn't it? But yeah, it's what we have, and it matters what you have. And there may be a sense that whatever you have, whatever those possessions are, and it may not be material possessions, it could be your knowledge, it could be your memories, and everything that gives yourself substance is just going to be important. And it has been important for some time, because Saturn, your ruler, moved into Pisces at the beginning of 2023, but now we've got the moon moving into Pisces as well. And perhaps you are just looking at everything that you have, and some of it is good and you're very pleased with it, but there may be also a certain sense that something may be missing. It could be financial, but it could be an experience, it could be a memory that is missing. A missing memory. Yeah, memories can be missing. You should remember something, and so what do you do to get in touch with that memory? There's always a way to get in touch with a memory, because memories are part of our possessions, and we need, I suppose, to hold on tightly to those possessions. Now, as an Aquarius, of course, I understand that with Pluto in Aquarius, there might be a certain sort of year zero feel to Aquarius. This is the brand new future. We need to forget the past. We need to forget about possessions, whether those possessions be about money or memories or feelings or qualifications. We need to forget about all of that. But, that is unrealistic, isn't it? You are your past, and you are everything you've collected from your past. And so you can't forget about that. And so you have to marshal it all. You need to sort of bring it together, and perhaps over the course of the day and into tomorrow, I think, because tomorrow Moon makes a conjunction to Saturn, you'll start to be aware of perhaps which possessions are important, what memories are important, and what memories just really aren't useful. Now, it may well be that money is important to you. Now, if that is the case, then I think that with Moon in Pisces, you perhaps are starting to think about your financial situation, perhaps in the light of the full moon. So there was a full moon yesterday, which was a full moon in Aquarius, and that full moon was, I think, quite dramatic. And remember, a full moon is not a one-day wonder. Its influence can go on for weeks. And so with this full moon, you saw the truth about the matter, about certain things. You see the truth. You can see the truth. The truth is still available to you. And now that the moon is in Pisces, having understood things, you're starting to see, perhaps in certain cases, the financial implications. And now that you understand the financial implications, or you're starting to see the financial implications, there may be an opportunity here to do something about it. I'm certainly not trying to pressurize you. And so if you feel now that there needs to be some change in terms of how you see money, how you use money, and how you earn money, how you make money, how you save money. That just could be something that you're thinking about. But, I must emphasize that it's not just about money. It is just about everything that you own. And it shouldn't be trivialized. And you can own things that are not simply material. Pisces. The moon is moving into your sign. So with the moon moving into your sign, I think you're feeling better. You're feeling that certain complications are starting to ease. We had all that chaos yesterday. Astrologically, yesterday was just really very busy. And now that the moon is moving into your sign, there's just a certain sense of comfort. Things are perhaps going back to normal. And maybe, Pisces, there's nothing much you actually have to do. You can be comfortable in yourself and you can do things on your terms. Remember, the moon, when it moves into Pisces, it doesn't actually make any aspects in Pisces. I mean, it makes a conjunction to Saturn tomorrow, but not today. And because of the moon isn't doing anything, maybe that's just a great opportunity to just put your feet up. I'm not saying you have to put your feet up. I don't think you're going to want to do that. But I think that whatever happens today, it should be done at your own pace, in your own way. And I think because you're going to have an overall impression of being quite relaxed and easygoing, I think other people are going to appreciate that. And they're going to respond to you in a sort of harmonious, easygoing kind of way, and they're going to want to make connections with you, or perhaps strengthen connections with you. So it may be a time in a sort of quite a gentle way that you can reach out to people, perhaps make them part of your life or a stronger part of your life. And perhaps if there are people you haven't talked to for some time, now might be a time to just open up a new line of communication, but in a very gentle way, not with any real purpose. There doesn't have to be a purpose today. And so that's probably all there is to say, though I can't avoid the fact that Venus is making a conjunction to true black moon Lilith. I have been talking about that to some of the signs with about this conjunction between Venus and true black moon Lilith. Venus is in Virgo, and Virgo is your opposite sign, and Venus may represent another person, a person who just may be bothered about something, maybe just a bit too intense for their own good. And so while I've talked about connections, and I've talked about the fact that it is a good time to meet new people, I suppose I'm talking about connections in a sort of a general sense. When it comes to specific one-to-one relationships, it may just be there's one person who is somewhat troubled, who's perhaps taking life far too seriously. And the reason they may be taking life far too seriously is because, with a Venus conjunct true black moon Lilith, maybe they are focusing on, dark areas in their life, things from the past that they're not comfortable with, but they can't get away from. And so do bear that in mind. And in one-to-one relationships, do make a special effort to understand. And I think that's something you can do. The moon is in Pisces. I think that does make you even more sensitive than usual. You are a sensitive person because you do have the moon in Pisces, but in terms of one-to-one relationships, your sensitivity could be useful in terms of just understanding what is holding someone back, and you must then use your sensitivity to work out the best way of dealing with the matter. And that's it. Those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now I'm going to look at today from the perspective of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Tuesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was number 46, which is pushing upwards. And this hexagram is talking about progress. We are able to move forward. We are able to make progress in a particular direction. And it's not really talking about the end result. It's not talking about the destination. It's just about making good progress, pushing upwards, and we are certainly going in the right direction. And this hexagram does have two moving lines. So the bottom line moves. And what the bottom line moving means, it's about the beginning of something, the start of our rise upwards, forwards, and we're just starting, and we're getting the trust that we need, and perhaps we're not getting the support and the recognition, and it just feels like it's the right thing to do. So perhaps if we have recently been delaying something, we have felt that now wasn't the right time. Maybe we were concerned about Mercury being retrograde or whatever. I know Mercury is still retrograde, but that doesn't mean that we have to bring everything to a halt. And with this hexagram 46, that first line moving, it's time to start. We're in the right position. We're getting the recognition we need, and we will make, I think, good progress. And then the fourth line moves as well. And so with the fourth line moving, really things are even better. We are starting to get recognition. Real recognition. And the I Ching even talks about fame. I'm not saying we're going to get fame, but what fame kind of means is that people are noticing us. So whatever our endeavours are that we've perhaps been delaying for a long time, we are definitely making progress, and we are definitely starting to get noticed. Now, because we have two lines moving, we move to a second hexagram, and so this moves to hexagram 19, and 19 is quite a socially orientated hexagram because it's approach. It means that we are literally approaching people, that we are getting closer to perhaps the people who matter, closer to maybe society in general, and we are being recognized. And one view of approach is that it's about leadership. So Greg Winkup, in his translation of the I Ching, he doesn't call this hexagram approach. He actually calls it leadership, I think. And so it seems that we are heading into a position where we do have to accept a certain leadership role, which means sort of, I suppose, advising people, indicating perhaps what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. Maybe a lot of people at the moment are really quite confused. We had this full moon yesterday. We had also, astrologically, things are pretty hectic at the moment, and people don't know what to do. Maybe we do know what to do, and maybe we just have a sense of how it's all happening, how it's all working out, and we can indeed set ourselves up as leaders. Well, it's not really setting ourselves up as leaders. We're not tin pot dictators. It's like there is a general groundswell of feeling that someone needs to take responsibility for what's happening, that someone needs to stand up and provide leadership, and that's going to be us. And so that's nothing to be concerned about. And I mean, I suppose leadership can take many forms. What does that mean if, for example, you're looking at this hexagram, you're looking at this I Ching reading and you're a hermit? I suppose if you're a hermit, you wouldn't be looking at the internet, would you? But if you were to be a hermit, I suppose what that would mean is some kind of self-leadership. You have to sort of look at what's happening in your own private life and say, I'm going to lead myself. I don't know how that works, but perhaps it's possible. But when we're talking about leadership, we may be only talking about temporary leadership. We don't want to be a leader for too long. That's a lot of responsibility. And the I Ching talks about the concept of when the 8th month comes, there is misfortune. And when the I Ching talks about the 8th month, it's really talking about the late summer from a Northern Hemisphere's perspective, as I understand it, sort of late August into September, because I suppose the Chinese New Year starts at the beginning. When did the Chinese New Year start? I mean, the Chinese New Year is, Chinese astrology. I mean, I know I do the I Ching, but I'm not great when it comes to China. I don't really know anything about Chinese astrology, but I think the Chinese New Year started sort of January the 25th, so that would, this year, is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. But that's when the year starts, and so then the 8th month, if your year's starting around January the 25th, your 8th month would be sort of August or September. And so if you are setting yourself up as a leader, or if you feel you're adopting a leadership role, it should be temporary, and probably by September you should be relinquishing it. You can be a leader up to a point and do what you can, but there will come a point where you can no longer have an influence on people. Perhaps just because things are just getting too complicated out there. It's not your fault, it's not your problem, it's just the way the world is. So perhaps now you can be a leader for as long as you can, but you have to recognize there will be a moment where you do have to relinquish that leadership. So that's the I Ching, and I now want to talk about Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, this is the first time I've ever had a midpoint, I think, as the theme of a video, so I'm not quite sure how it's going to work. I understand that most people don't use midpoints. When I was doing my diploma at the Faculty of Astrological Studies in the 80s, there was a Midpoints and Harmonics course taken by Mike Harding, which was a really good course, and Midpoints was very much part of the Faculty of Astrological Studies syllabus. I don't know whether it's still part of their syllabus, and I find I'm using midpoints more and more. So just to tell you what a midpoint is, a midpoint is literally the midpoint between two planets. So if I've got, say for example, you've got your sun at 0 degrees Aries and the moon at 0 degrees Taurus, the sun-moon midpoint will be halfway between the two. So that's an easy one. It will be at 15 degrees Aries, halfway between the two. And there's astrological software that will calculate what midpoints are, but I think it's possible that you maybe don't have access to that. And I don't know whether astro.com has any midpoint calculators. I'm not sure if they do. I don't know. But if you want to calculate a midpoint, you just have to find the point between two planets, the exact point. Now, for 0 degrees for Aries, the midpoint between 0 degrees Aries and 0 degrees Taurus is easy. But what about if it's between 15 Virgo and 27 Aquarius? What do you do? Well, what you do is, now I should make it clear, don't don't worry if this doesn't make sense. I'm gonna put the description in. I'm gonna put this in both the description and the pinned comment. What I'm going to say, so don't feel you have to take notes or anything. But what it is you simply convert a planet into, you can convert the two planets into their absolute longitude, and you add them together and you divide by 2. So absolute longitude means 0 degrees Aries has an absolute longitude of 0. 0 degrees Taurus has an absolute longitude of 30. 0 degrees Pisces has an absolute longitude of 330, and then you add the two planets together, and then you divide by 2, and that's the midpoint, and then you convert back into the zodiac. And if anything is conjunct, square, or opposition, that midpoint with a 1.5 degree orb maximum, then you can say you've got a planet on a midpoint. And you can use semi-squares and sesquiquadrates. I use semi-squares and sesquiquadrates as well, but in this section I'm not going to look at examples of semi-square sesquiquadrate midpoints. And so don't be overwhelmed by it. I suppose I must emphasize that midpoints are really important. I just think it's so important, if you want to understand a chart, to look at midpoints. I just think not using midpoints, I don't know, just doesn't seem right to me. I mean, of course you can interpret a chart without midpoints. And of course I have my own way of doing astrology, and there are different approaches to astrology, and most approaches to astrology don't need midpoints. So I don't want to be doctrinaire here. So when I say you must use midpoints, that's wrong. I'm not saying that at all. You don't have to use midpoints at all. I'm just sharing perhaps the way I work. So one midpoint I really want to be looking at is the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and the fact that today, Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So let me just show you exactly what that means. So here's the positions of the planets today. So you can see here is Mars, here is Saturn, and the midpoint of Mars and Saturn is, the exact midpoint is going to be at about, it's going to be about 4 Taurus. And so Venus is sesquiquadrate the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, that's perhaps a somewhat complex example, because you have to think about semi-squares and sesquiquadrates. And in the examples I use, I will be using conjunction squares and opposition. So what does it mean to have Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint? So Venus is a planet of women. It's a planet of relating. It can be about money. And so if it's on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, it's unlikely to be fortunate. The pair Mars-Saturn can be about delay. It can be about destruction. It can be about frustration. And so if you've got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, it may indicate some area of frustration, or it can be about structure, feeling you very much have to structure the way you relate to other people, and that would perhaps be a more positive way in which Venus aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint could be working. But there could also be a sort of a toughness in dealing with other people, a harshness if someone has got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And at the same time, it can represent a vulnerability. It can, in certain cases, can represent, if you take Mars-Saturn in the most extreme way, Mars-Saturn is a pair connected with death. And so Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint could be the death of a young woman. That's one way of looking at it. And I will be looking at an example of that. Now, before I look at some examples, I want to just go over what Reinhold Ebertin and Alfred Witter said about Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, don't necessarily take this literally. Some of these interpretations might sound a bit extreme. So here's what Reinhold Ebertin, the German astrologer Reinhold Ebertin, said about Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So he says, coldness of feeling and frigidity, an absence of feeling and sensitive perception, a loveless disposition, the inability to love and to express love, illness, separation, loss, parentheses, death of female persons. So you get the feeling that he's talking about women a lot, but also he's talking about the lovelessness and coldness of potentially of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, turning to what Alfred Witter and his colleagues wrote about Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, another German astrologer, and we have what he says is Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. He says Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. He says insensibility, ingratitude for kind action, actions of separation by female persons, death of female persons, also of mother, blood relatives, or close acquaintances. So, similar picture there. So, let's start by looking at someone who has got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. He's not someone I know much about, but this is Nicolas Maduro. He is the president of Venezuela. Remember, Venezuela has just had an election. The opposition claim that it was a stolen election. The Americans claim that it was a stolen election. But Maduro has been in power for some time. He is, I think he has sort of working class roots. He was, I think he was a bus driver before he got, I think he was involved in the unions, but when Hugo Chavez died, he became president of Venezuela. And there is his Venus, and so you can see there's his Mars, and there's his Saturn. So he's got a very wide Mars-Saturn opposition. I mean, a hugely wide Mars-Saturn opposition. But Venus is on the T. And so he's got Venus on the Mars-Saturn opposition. So if you've got a politician who's got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, you can see the toughness there, the ability to make tough decisions. And perhaps, I don't know anything about Nicolas Maduro, but there is a certain insensitivity there, perhaps the insensitivity to the suffering of the people of Venezuela, or the refusal to accept that suffering, perhaps, or he might even understand that suffering, but take the view this has to be done. Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, what he's like on a personal level, I have absolutely no idea. But one would have expected, okay, it's not just that you have to look at Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint in isolation. You can also look at other things you can see about Venus. He's got Venus in Scorpio on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So that suggests to me this man is really quite tough. He could be quite unpleasant, and I'm not making any political opinion on. I'm not about Nicolas Maduro. I mean, there are two ways of looking at him. But he's got Venus conjunct Neptune, and it's on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So there could be a certain sense of unpleasantness there. And, as Venus is a female planet, so it would be interesting to know how he treated women, how he treated the women I suppose he meets in politics, and also what his family think about him. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. But that would perhaps be an example of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Another example of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, someone I don't really know anything about. I know about him. That is George Harrison. So George Harrison, the Beatle, who died some time ago. He was a heavy smoker, wasn't he? I think, and that had a role to play in his death. And there is George Harrison's Venus at 29 Pisces. So in one sense, it's a nice Venus, because it's in Pisces in its exaltation, yet it's quite close to the fixed star Skeet, to do with disasters and so on. And Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. You can see there's Mars, there's Saturn. So Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Now, George Harrison is someone who basically has a good press. He is someone who, a talented musician. That's what we know about him. A very talented musician, a very talented guitarist. And you might then see here perhaps an example of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint working in a positive way, because I suppose Venus is about music, isn't it? It has to be about music. And so with Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, that may be about incredible discipline. I know lots of people play the guitar, but actually playing the guitar well, it's an extremely difficult thing, I think, to play the guitar well, as with any musical instrument. But it must require a huge amount of dedication, perhaps a punishing level of dedication. And so maybe George Harrison's Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint is an example of the aspect working well. I don't know when he learnt what was going on in his life when he was learning to play the guitar, but maybe that had an impact. Maybe his relationship to the guitar had perhaps has had some link with other things going on in his life. I don't know, but he certainly had Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. I suppose you could say Venus is about the musician, and Venus on the Mars-Saturn is the musician who is dead. That's one way of looking at it, but I suppose every musician has to die at some stage. I know he died young, relatively young. He didn't die young as in Jimi Hendrix, but or Jim Morrison, but he, as far as I know, he died in middle age. Perhaps if he hadn't have smoked, he would have lived longer. But maybe you know more about George Harrison than me. But he did have Venus conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And another person who broadly has a lot of good press, who actually also died, I believe, because she smoked too much. So George Harrison died because he smoked too much. And I know that, and Diana Rigg. So Diana Rigg died of cancer. She was a heavy smoker. And so I believe, I may be wrong, but I think her smoking had an impact on her death. She was over 80 when she died, so she didn't exactly die young, but I suppose nowadays people often expect to live into their 90s, and she did die of cancer. And Diana Rigg, of course, originally famous for the Avengers, but of course she in old age she became famous again, I think, through Game of Thrones. I never watched Game of Thrones in my life. I know nothing about it, but I know that she was in it. And so Diana Rigg had Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So you can see there's her Venus, and there is her Mars and her Saturn. So this Mars-Saturn, in this case, her Mars-Saturn midpoint is at around 6 Gemini. So in her case, Venus was square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So it doesn't have to be just conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It can be square as well. And so, like George Harrison, I suppose she was very hardworking, and she was perhaps a perfectionist. she was a classically trained actor, and she was if you look at her interviews, she was pretty harsh, and she clearly didn't suffer fools gladly, and that is certainly that's perhaps how Venus on the Mars-Saturn works. It can be, perhaps we're getting the idea of a creative perfectionist, in perhaps in the arts, so that might be a way of working. I don't really want to make a link between Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint and dying of cancer. I mean, I know we've got George Harrison and both her and Diana Guy, but I think on a sample of 2, I wouldn't want to read that too much into it. I think perhaps if someone is involved in acting or music and they've got Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, sure, it can have a negative side to it. It can make them harsh, but it can also perhaps turn them into something of a perfectionist. And looking at another person who had Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint is Robert Maxwell, the bouncing check. He was because he originally came from, I think, Slovakia actually, but he had this newspaper empire and he stole his pensioners' funds, and he in the end committed suicide. I don't have his time of birth, but there's his Venus and his Mars, his Mars-Saturn midpoint. So he has his Mars-Saturn midpoint with it around 23 Leo. So he had Venus square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Venus quite close to Algol, this rather difficult fixed star. So Venus on Mars-Saturn midpoint. I think at times he treated women quite badly. He treated people quite badly as well. So if you've got Venus square Mars-Saturn midpoint, it depends on who you are, but there is the capacity perhaps for treating people badly. And Venus can also be connected with money. And here is someone who committed suicide because he basically had run out of money. He'd spent other people's money. And so in his case, it was, I would have said, quite malefic. And Venus could represent the mother, the women in your life, and also it can represent you as a woman and or a girl and what happens to you. And so here's a chart that I have looked at quite recently. I apologize if you've seen this chart before, but here is the chart of Helga Goebbels. So Helga Goebbels was the oldest child of Magda and Joseph Goebbels. Do you remember Joseph Goebbels was a Nazi propaganda minister, and he married Magda Goebbels, and they had 5 children or something like that. And right at the end, the children were killed. They were murdered with cyanide. And Helga Goebbels was the oldest of the children, and she appears to be the one that knew what was going on. She was the one that resisted. She knew her mother and the SS doctor were trying to kill her, and she resisted. So if you look at her chart, there's her Venus and there's her Mars. So she had Venus. There's her Venus square her Mars-Saturn midpoint. So we can see Venus in 2 ways. Venus can be about this mother, this sort of fairly murderous mother, but this could also be the girl. She was 12 when she was murdered. The girl who is killed, the dead girl, and she has Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and she was murdered, and I think that sort of fits. And continuing on the theme of the Nazis, again, another chart I've looked at before, and this is where we kind of see double Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So this is Sophie Scholl, who she resisted Nazism in Munich. I think she was 22 or something when she was executed, and she put up these posters around Munich condemning Nazism and just telling people that the war is lost and it's all a waste of time. And at her trial, she refused to back down. She refused to compromise. She stood up to the judge, and so she was guillotined. And so, looking at her Venus, we can see that there's her Venus at 24 Aries. So her Mars, and there's her Mars and her Saturn. So her Venus was square her Mars-Saturn midpoint. So that could just be, in this case, just the young woman who ends up being executed. That's literally how we could see it. And she seems to resonate to the energy of Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So this is a chart for when she was executed. So she was executed on February the 22nd, 1943. So she was executed on February the 22nd, 1943. So yeah, so she was 21. So she was 21 when she was executed. So here's a chart for the execution, and there is Venus, and there is Mars and Saturn. And so Venus was conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint when she was executed. So she was born with Venus square the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and she was executed with Venus conjunct the Mars-Saturn midpoint. And that's the moment. So Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, the death of a woman. Now, I understand 1943, women were being killed and murdered all over Europe, all over German-occupied Europe. But she was perhaps quite iconic. And I suppose iconic people get sort of marked out by the stars, if you like. It sounds unfair, but her memory has continued, where perhaps other women and girls who were being killed at the same time, their memory perhaps has been forgotten. Yeah, it is unfair, but in her case, yeah, it is Venus on the Mars-Saturn, the young woman being killed, the young woman being martyred. Now, someone who did not have Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint was Joan Vollmer. So Joan Vollmer was Bill Burroughs' wife. So Bill Burroughs was this, obviously this renowned American writer, and he married Joan Vollmer. And Joan Vollmer did not have Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, but she did have Venus square Saturn. Venus square Saturn might be a mistreated woman. That is quite possible. So Joan Vollmer, she married Bill Burroughs, and so she was born in February 1923, and so when she was what she would have been, I suppose, in her late 20s, on September the 6th, 1951, William Burroughs was drunk in a hotel in Mexico City, and I think she put a glass on her head, and he attempted to shoot the glass off her head, but he didn't. I think he hit her, and he killed her. And this is a chart. I don't know precisely when it was, for the time when Joan Vollmer was killed by William Burroughs. And at the time, there's Venus. Venus was on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, so this would be death of a woman. Again, I understand women were dying all the time in Mexico City, but it seems that astrology is very good at marking out the famous deaths, like the death of Sophie Scholl, like the death of Joan Vollmer. I think I was listening to an interview, was it Allen Ginsberg? Allen Ginsberg was saying, how this was a very important moment in Bill's life from a creative perspective. And I don't know how traumatized he was, but I think it was in Naked Lunch. Bill Burroughs talks about this. He talks about the William Tell routine, I think. So he's kind of making light of what he did later on. I mean, that's... That's Bill Burroughs for you, but I suppose he was a very good writer. And now, looking at a couple of events with Mars-Saturn, with Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Venus is about money and perhaps loss of money. And so here's a chart for the opening bell, I believe, of the stock market on October the 19th, 1987, which was Black Monday, when the stock market fell 20% that day. And there is Venus, and you can see Venus was on the Mars-Saturn midpoint at the opening bell. And sure, there are lots of other times when Venus is on the Mars-Saturn midpoint at the opening bell, but I suppose when you bring this together with all the strains in the economy and what was going on in 1987, so Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, stock market falls 20%, a lot of people lose a lot of money. So that is a potential manifestation of it. Should you get married with Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint? Well, probably in most cases it's fine to get married with Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. But it just so happened that Roman Polanski married Sharon Tate on January the 20th, 1968. And as we know, the following year, Sharon Tate was murdered by the Manson gang. And at the time of the marriage, Venus was at 22 Sagittarius, and there is Saturn, there's Mars. So Venus was square the Mars-Saturn midpoint when Roman Polanski married Sharon Tate. And Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, death of a woman, death of a bride. And so that's what happened. That's what happened the following year when Sharon Tate was murdered. And finally, I want to consider two countries with Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and one of these countries is Ukraine. This is the chart for Ukraine's independence, and there is Ukraine's Venus, and there's the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So the Mars-Saturn, there's Mars, there's Saturn. So I think the Mars-Saturn midpoint is approximately sort of 28 Scorpio. So I think that Venus is square the Mars-Saturn midpoint in Ukraine's chart. So what does that mean? Well, Venus could be the economy, and basically since independence, the economy has done really badly in Ukraine. It's just it's a disaster, and that's been a case since independence. And secondly, Venus can be about foreign relations, I suppose, and so how it's managed its foreign relations, and it's had its relationship with the United States, it's had its relationship with Russia, and Venus on the Mars-Saturn, it hasn't worked well at all. So I think that in this case it has been something of a negative, but I mean I wouldn't necessarily read too much into it. It's just perhaps just not good to have Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. It's perhaps about aesthetics. It's about how the country relates to itself. Venus is about relating. Is the country easy with itself? And perhaps with Venus on the Mars squaring a Mars-Saturn midpoint, it just really is not easy with itself. And with these midpoints, Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint, I've been talking about conjunctions, squares, and oppositions. I haven't been talking about semi-squares and sesquiquadrates. But there is a country that does have Venus, I think, sesquiquadrate the Mars-Saturn midpoint, and that is the United States. So the United States' Mars-Saturn midpoint is at there's Mars, there's Saturn. Its Mars-Saturn midpoint is, I think, at around 1805 Leo. And that means its Venus is semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint. So the United States has Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. Does this say anything about women? I don't think so. I mean, I know you could always point to examples of women being treated badly in the United States, but all things being equal, probably women have better rights in the United States than in most countries. Could it just be about the internal cohesion of the country? It's about relating to the outside world, relating to itself. The United States has been at war for on and off for all of its existence. It's still at war in a way. I mean, it's fighting its war against Ukraine, but it's still there. I mean, is that Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint? I mean, I don't think it entirely fits. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is fighting its war against. Sorry, not is it fighting a war against Ukraine? It's fighting against Russia, isn't it? With Ukraine as its proxy, but that's an example of its war. But what does it really mean for the United States to have Venus semi-square its Mars-Saturn midpoint? And as I said, it might just be at a country that is just not particularly at ease with itself. But perhaps this is my homework to you. What does it really mean? If you live in America, does it make any sense to you for America to have Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint? You know, is there something special about America which marks it out as having Venus semi-square the Mars-Saturn midpoint, or is it just meaningless? So that's my question to you, and perhaps you can give me some ideas, in the comments, or give everyone some ideas. How does it work? Because I've thought about this a lot, and it's a very close aspect, and yeah, I would be interested in that. So if you've got any insights, I would be really grateful for them. Okay, I've gone on for long enough. That's all I'm going to say about Venus on the Mars-Saturn midpoint. If you've enjoyed this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I would of course be super grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. So thank you very much for listening, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.